Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto this week, the 2026 Farm Bill advances out of committee with no changes to the federal hemp ban planned for November.
The big thing that it does is it sort of divides farming into two categories. So you're in the industrial hemp lane, and that's fiber, grain, seed, essentially non-cannabinoids is kind of the way I'm looking at it.
We'll talk with Adam Rosenberg, chairman of the board of the NCIA, who welcomed 7 new members to their board of directors this past week.
That's right. So there was no additional relief within the Farm Bill draft for the thousands of hemp businesses, which also has implications in terms of access in places where THC is only available through these hemp channels.
Plus, on the federal front, the director of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, gets fired by President Donald Trump. You might remember she was the former governor of South Dakota who reversed a voter initiative for adult use that passed when she served that state. And New York welcomes a new executive director of the OCM Regulatory Commission. His name is John Kajia, and he's a veteran of the industry and someone who's been interviewed not once, but twice on pro-cannabis media. He is bullish on New York State's cannabis future.
New York is really starting to show that it is the most exciting, most dynamic, and most opportunity-rich market in the country.
All that, plus the U.S. Supreme Court hears oral arguments on the gun rights for cannabis users case that brought together the NRA and NORML fighting for the rights to bear arms even if you use cannabis. All that and our state reports and our international news on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. This is the program WPCMTV continues to document the fight to end cannabis prohibition here in the United States and around the world. If you've been following our coverage over the years, you understand that when the Farm Bill of 2018 was passed with a legal loophole definition of hemp, it launched a multi-billion-dollar industry with no regulations for distribution or age gating. And then these products sprang up for sale at convenience stores, gas stations, and smoke shops, including states that had a strict medical program or no medical cannabis at all. Now, Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell has admitted that they made a mistake, thinking that if they controlled the intoxicating THC cannabinoid, then this plant would only be used for industrial and textile products. On top of that so-called loophole, the FDA was supposed to come up with regulations and rules for these 0.3% THC-infused products, but to this day, 8 years later, the FDA has yet to offer any guidelines or controls for the use of any cannabinoids in the consumable products. The FDA already missed one of President Trump's deadlines to come up a list of cannabinoids. That list is now up to over 400 cannabinoids. And last fall, when the government shut down, it was the unregulated hemp market that helped bring both sides of the political aisle together. Of course, they all agreed to ban all low percentage THC hemp products across the country. At that point, the hemp market was close to being as big as the legal licensed market for cannabis, both between 28 and 32 billion a year. For the past year or so, Carrie Hinkle helped us cover the battle for survival of that billion-dollar industry. And this week, the Farm Bill of 2026 has moved out of committee, and they made no changes to that federal ban on THC-infused products that goes into effect in November. But since November, the hemp lobby tried and asked for a postponement of that deadline for 1 or 2 years, and of course, Congress balked at that delay. Now, the first draft of the 2026 Farm Bill has emerged out of the Agricultural Committee with no change to the federal ban of the products. Plus, each package is being capped at 0.4% THC. We have reaction to this week's news from 3 organizations, one from Chris Lindsey from the American Trade Association of Cannabis and hemp companies called ATACH. and another one with the chairman of the board of the NCIA, Adam Rosenberg. And finally, executive producer Jimmy Young talks with NORML's Morgan Fox about the firing of Kristi Noem from Homeland Security. As governor of South Dakota, she was no fan of cannabis.
So there was no additional relief within the Farm Bill draft for the thousands of hemp businesses, which also has implications in terms of access in places where THC is only available through these hemp channels. But at the end of the day, we're talking about one plant, we're talking about cannabinoids and end products, and really the entire cannabis ecosystem needs relief. All of these businesses that are operating in good faith to try to create access to safe, tested, reliable products are missing action from the federal government to align what is a widely used product and one that is much safer within regulated channels. And so I'm hopeful that we start to see broader progress beyond just a farm bill to actually start to regulate these products responsibly in general.
The big thing that it does is it sort of divides farming into two categories. So you're in the industrial hempline, and that's fiber, grain, seed, essentially non-cannabinoids is kind of the way I'm looking at it. And then there's the not industrial hemp category, and that is everything else, right, including cannabinoids. The mechanics of how that works, all to be determined. So USDA would be required to go into rulemaking and figure out what all that stuff actually is going to mean. Second thing it does is it lines up the THC testing standard that USDA has with the new definition that was adopted back in November, which is based on total THC and not Delta 9 THC only. Like I mentioned kind of in my intro, it does reduce burdens for industrial hemp farmers. So if you fall into that category, then you're relieved of a lot of the hoops that you otherwise have to jump through. So now you don't have to do the testing standards the same. You can do visual inspections. You can do performance-based sampling, which is great. This is, by the way, just a little nuance in here. It's permissive, so it's not a mandatory thing. USDA doesn't have to do that, so it's something to kind of track. We'd want to see that happen. There's some documentation requirements. Bottom line is if you're in the industrial hemp category and you don't meet your documentation requirements, you kind of have to follow the harder testing standards that would otherwise apply.
So glad to be joined by Morgan Fox, the political director of NORML down in Washington, D.C. Hey, Morgan, it's been too long, and a happy new year to you, and it's good to see you again.
You too, Jimmy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and there is a news item that has something to do with cannabis, if you will, because when Kristi Noem was governor of South Dakota, she was not very friendly and fought the medical cannabis initiative, and now she's looking for work. Is that going to have any impact on anything, really?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. Obviously, Kristi Noem has a whole lot of baggage associated with her and has done some really, really questionable and terrible things as head of DHS. But as governor of South Dakota, she was almost single-handedly responsible for shutting down the adult use law that voters overwhelmingly passed there in the early aughts and used state money to do so. Unfortunately, she was never called to account for that. But I think we can squarely place the blame on her and her office for the fact that South Dakotans are still being arrested for cannabis. And I think in terms of DHS, I think it is notable to point out that cannabis possession continues to be one of the top 5 triggers for deportation in this country for people that are here lawfully in every other aspect, and has been for decades. It's a very, very easy, low-hanging fruit way to label somebody a criminal and get them removed from the country. It's also used as a way to deny citizenship applications under what's called low moral character. So I don't necessarily think that anything will particularly change policy-wise when it comes to cannabis and DHS, but fingers crossed. One thing that I'm hoping that we stop seeing is Customs and Border Patrol interference with legal intrastate shipments. We're seeing this a lot in New Mexico right now, and I'm worried that we might see it elsewhere, where legal producers are shipping product within state, not even crossing state borders, but they are crossing the line of jurisdiction for Customs and Border Patrol, which is within 100 miles of any U.S. border. And they're getting stopped, having all the product seized, confiscated, and destroyed, in some cases having vehicles seized, and having the drivers be temporarily detained. This is costing New Mexico, legal licensed New Mexico businesses millions of dollars.
All three of those complete interviews with Kimmie are available on demand on the WPCMTV.com website and will be released on our YouTube channel later this week. Also last week, the NCIA named 7 new board members, and one is longtime supporter of pro-cannabis media, Jamie Pearson from the New Holland Group. Plus, another new member is Merino PR principal Jordan Eisenstadt, along with Dr. Roz McCarthy, Casey Colross, Allison Disney, John Murray, and Samuel Rockwell Shear. One more note on the firing of Kristi Noem as the head of Homeland Security. She was grilled by senators this past week over the $220 million advertising campaign starring herself, and then lying about having the president's approval. So perhaps that was the biggest reason for her dismissal by President Trump. So while Kristi Noem adds her name to the unemployed jobs report that came out this past week, one state that has a cannabis-friendly governor in their state house is Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. She provided the Democrat response after President Trump's State of the Union address 2 weeks ago. She is now waiting to sign 2 legalization bills that are moving through the House and Senate to pave the way toward adult use sales opening this fall. With more from Virginia, here's Joe Parsons.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WV, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. As Virginia inches closer and closer to becoming the 25th operational adult use state, it is important to remember why a safe and well-regulated market is needed. The biggest reason for a lot of us is to reduce illegal marketplaces and keep untested and dangerous products out of the Commonwealth. This week in Virginia Beach, Timothy Reagan Jr., 39, was arrested for selling illegal cannabis products and psilocybin mushrooms from a local business. Police seized 11 pounds of cannabis, 5 ounces of mushrooms, and untested THC gummy products. A firearm was also found on scene, along with an undisclosed amount of cash. Reagan is facing multiple felony charges and is one of many in the area to attempt to run illegal cannabis markets from either the home or the workplace. Another legacy bust this week that hits close to home for me is in Fluvanna County. Police performed a routine traffic stop on Interstate 64 within Fluvanna, and they found the new definition of a roach coach. That's right, they found 14 pounds of cannabis, 2 pounds of mushrooms, 136 vape pens, thousands of dollars, and 2 firearms in the vehicle. Cameron Sheeran, Corwin Baker, and Christopher Edwards were arrested and are facing multiple felony charges. With enough product on board to run a shop on wheels, these type of operations are some of the hardest to contain and catch. Fluvanna Sheriff Eric Hess was thankful to the 3A Task Force and the Albemarle County Police for their help in getting this much unregulated product from off the streets. Well, that's going to do it for this week from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WV in Charlottesville. And as always, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Joe Parsons. Until next time, stay lifted.
You have to wonder how long New Hampshire advocates can keep fighting for an adult use legalization. Every time there is any progress, it always gets shut down by the Republican-controlled Senate. Even if they ever did get a bill to Governor Kelly Ayotte, she said many times over the years that she would never sign it. New Hampshire is the only state in the 6-state New England region that does not have adult use legalization. Meanwhile, in Michigan, prices are falling, sales are down, and now with a 24% tax increase, businesses are getting even more stressed out while they face a tough decision about just keeping the doors open. Here's our Michigan correspondent, Amie Carter.
I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Weisters with this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Michigan's legal cannabis got off to a rough start this year. Sales dropped about 16% in January, landing near $227 million. That's one of the steepest month-to-month declines since adult use legalization began in 2018, according to the Crain's Detroit Business. Small cannabis businesses say the pressure is being made worse by Michigan's new 24% wholesale cannabis tax. Operators describe the rollout as confusing and costly, squeezing already thin margins. Meanwhile, some multi-state companies were able to stockpile inventory ahead of the tax, leaving many locally owned dispensaries struggling to keep up. That tax is now facing a challenge in Lansing. State Senator Jonathan Lindsey has introduced legislation to repeal the 24% wholesale marijuana tax, which was created during the 2025 budget negotiations to help fund road repairs. The bill has been referred to the Senate Government Operations Committee as criticism continues across the industry. Michigan Weedsters supports this bill, although some patients and caregivers disagree. Some believe weakening the metric tracking system is a positive step. Others argue that voter-initiated cannabis laws should not be changed without following the proper legislative process. Critics say the tax increase ultimately hurts consumers, workers, and small Michigan cannabis businesses. Cannabis advertising is also drawing attention. In a letter from the Detroit Free Press, a Royal Oak resident said he was embarrassed by the number of cannabis billboards along I-75, arguing they create a negative first impression of Michigan. Meanwhile, Michigan State Police say they've shut down a large illegal grow operation in Metro Detroit. Authorities report seizing more than 11,000 cannabis plants, over 40 pounds of processed flower, multiple firearms, high-end jewelry, and roughly $146,000 in cash. And finally, Hash Bash returns to the University of Michigan. The event began in 1972 as a smoke-in protest after activist John Sinclair was sentenced to prison for possessing only 2 joints. While cannabis is now legal in Michigan, the event remains a symbol of resistance to federal prohibition. Expect speeches, petition drives, and the traditional mass light-up at noon. One more note this year, the Monroe Street Fair will not take place. Organizers say it could not be produced responsibly in 2026, and the future of the event remains uncertain. That's it for this week. I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Weedsters for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In Massachusetts, a recent poll by a UNH group concluded that the ballot initiative funded by the prohibitionist group SAM, or Smart Approaches to Marijuana, is going to fail in the next election. Just 20% of the people asked in this survey supported the controversial amendment to shut down the adult use market. 63% want the industry to be left alone, and the other 17% are leaning towards allowing the laws to stand. Curtis Emery has been doing a great job keeping track of this movement, and here is his Bay State Cannabis Report this week.
I'm Curtis Emery from Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This news week in the Bay State, the CCC has been hard at work managing a couple of different task items. One of those task items would be they're looking for a new ID vendor to help with the badging and security badging that's needed all over the cannabis space here in Massachusetts, specifically for companies like vertically integrated companies who manage from seed to sale. Some workers in those spaces need multiple badges just to get from one side of the building to the other. The CCC is hoping to find a new vendor who can offer advantageous modernized badging systems that allow multi-space access without wearing multiple badges. This will cut down costs for companies looking to badge agents across multiple spaces, as well as just make it a little bit more easier for cannabis and mass to function. Also from the CCC, as they have a group looking to cut some red tape in the state, they're also raising the alarm or shedding some light on some of the most common violations here in the state. They kind of range the gamut from poor record keeping when it comes to disposing product or variances between metric and what's on the sales floor, as well as more common retail practices such as unlawful advertising, as well as lapsing in vendor training for bud tenders and the like. Hopefully the CCC is hoping that they can, not only keep the regulations that we have in place going, but also pharma regulations which are in place, which might be burdening the companies out there trying to operate here in Mass. I've been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report, Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Well, do you like the smell of cannabis? Some find that aroma pleasantly herbal. Others call it disgusting. Some even dislike the smell of cigarettes, but tolerate it because it's been accepted for decades. Public consumption of cannabis in adult use legal states is always an issue because for years, users would find an escape down an alley or out in the woods to partake with the plant. Now that smell is fueling more prohibitionist rhetoric, and in Arizona. The legislature is trying to do something, though, about it there. 2 bills called the Evil Twins are trying to create misdemeanor fines if your neighbors find it annoying enough to make a complaint. This has happened regularly in grow farms, with the pungent herbal aroma getting into the air and floating across property lines. It's just another example of how far the industry has to go before normalization and acceptance sets in. With more from the Southwest states, here's Tina Tasaka.
I'm Tina Tasaka with Iconic Representation and Cannabis Sex America, and this is the Southwest Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Senior residents in Arizona independent living communities may soon be able to access cannabis through on-site ordering kiosks. Retailer Life is Chill and technology company LoveBud announced a partnership to place kiosks inside participating communities. Residents will be able to review product information and place delivery orders directly from licensed dispensaries. James Watkins, CEO of LoveBud, said the kiosks create a simple ordering experience while opening new revenue opportunities for dispensaries. Dr. Dana Lillistol, Senior Education Advocate for Life is Chill, said the model can improve access and education for older adults, offer clear product information, and guided ordering to help remove common barriers. Participation will vary by community, but the program could significantly expand safe, convenient cannabis access for seniors. Zen Leaf Dispensaries is celebrating some of Arizona's most loyal cannabis consumers with its new Zen Roots, Adopt a Plant Legends program. Last fall, Verano's Tempe cultivation team planted 36 cannabis plants named after select legend customers, complete with a 24/7 live stream. After touring their plants and meeting cultivation staff, the legends returned this month for a final harvest celebration, receiving custom Savvy and On the Rocks products made from their own namesake plants. Verano operates 8 Zen Leaf locations statewide, including Phoenix, Chandler, Gilbert, Mesa, Prescott, and Tempe. Federal and local agents swarmed a quiet West Las Vegas cul-de-sac this week, raiding a private home suspected of operating a large illegal marijuana grow. Officers from Las Vegas Metro, FBI, and the DEA executed the warrant on Coyote Crest Court after neighbors reported a strong odor coming from the residence. Inside, investigators uncovered more than 800 marijuana plants, along with commercial-grade grow equipment, including lighting rigs, ventilation systems, fertilizer, and large plastic bags used for processing. The entire street was locked down for hours as detectives cleared the home and removed evidence. Authorities say the scale of the operation far exceeded Nevada's legal home grow limits, which cap households at 12 plants per specific conditions. No arrest totals have been released. That's it for the Southwest Highlights. I'm Tina Tasaka with Iconic Representation and Cannabis Sex America for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Next up is Oklahoma, where their governor, Kevin Stitt, continues to alienate his state's existing medical program that has really been mismanaged since its inception. In the beginning, after the Department of Health gave out the original amount of licenses like ice cream, Adria Berry was appointed to clean up that mess. And now Governor Stitt has given her the title of Secretary in Licensing and Regulation. You do have to remember that the governor has made it clear he wants to shut down the medical program, so it will be interesting to keep an eye on what her plans are. Kimmie Cannabis shared that story that broke overnight. Here's more from the Sooner State.
I am Kimmie Cannabis with Can I Talk About It with your Oklahoma Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Frustration is boiling over across Oklahoma as patients and business owners push back against Governor Kevin Stitt's constant attacks on the state's medical cannabis industry. All across the state, Oklahomans are speaking out on local news stations, social media, and community forums, trying to combat his mistruths and ignorance regarding this plant and the program. For many patients managing chronic pain, autoimmune diseases, PTSD, and cancer, cannabis isn't politics, it's medicine. And for thousands of Oklahomans, it's also their livelihood. Families have poured their savings, their time, and their hearts into building legitimate cannabis businesses. They followed the rules, paid their taxes, and helped build one of the strongest medical-only cannabis markets in the country. As cited on the Oklahoma Senate site, the total revenue impact is over $678 million in total taxes, excise and sales tax. They were collected between 2019 and 2023. With recent sales data in 2025, Oklahoma maintained its status as the second most robust medical-only market in the U.S., next to Florida, with roughly $336.8 million in sales through June 2025, generating $23.5 million in tax revenue during that period. Advocates say those numbers represent more than money. They represent jobs, small businesses, and patients who finally found relief. Now many are calling on Governor Stitt to stop attacking the program and start listening to the people who built it. That's it from Oklahoma. I'm Kimmie Cannabis. Peace, love, and all that good stuff.
That'll do it for the A Block this week. We still have our international roundup coming up next. Plus, we'll introduce you to John Kagia, the new executive director of New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
New York is really starting to show that it is the most exciting, most dynamic, and most opportunity-rich market in the country.
Your cannabis business could be overpaying by hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal income taxes because of one simple assumption that you're making about your accountant. A dispensary owner in Colorado called me frustrated as hell. He'd been working with the same accountant for 3 years. His accountant said, "What's 471C?" Here's what the ignorance of that accountant was costing this business owner: $180,000 every single year for 3 years. 471C has been around since 2017. We're talking about an 8-year-old tax provision that many cannabis CPAs don't fully understand. 471C is one of the most complex and highly debated tax strategies in the cannabis industry. If you want to make sure you're not leaving any money on the table, I'm offering free 471C reviews this month. Link in the description.
Accounting Buds has grown into Buds Group, the same award-winning quality, now with more service offerings. Buds Group, your best buds in the biz.
Looking for PR that over-delivers on expectations? At Maverick Public Relations, they pair big agency experience with personalized attention. From launching award-winning brands to securing top-tier media hits, their data-driven communications team helps visionary leaders and entrepreneurs rise above the media noise. Maverick PR is responsive, collaborative, and relentless about results and ROI. Visit themaverickpr.com and make headlines together.
If you want to make history, if you want to be part of history, if you want to say you helped legalize marijuana in America, now is the time to join us.
Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. Before we get to Dave Barton's report from the UK, We have one note about Argentina. The South American nation has a schedule of legal controlled substances with different requirements and regulations. And this week, Argentina rewrote their own Controlled Substances Act, which is something advocates in the US would love to see happen in the future. But this government seems more interested in delaying any rescheduling anytime in the future. So now let's check in with the cannabis scene in Canada with Debbie Facey and the UK and Europe with Dave Barton.
Hello and welcome to this week's report from me, Dave Barton of Thermidor, with your international cannabis report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. So what's the news from Europe this week? Well, the cannabis conversation this week shifted from growth to resilience and from theory to reality. In Poland, new data shows that the medical cannabis market has made a full recovery from the 2024 telemedicine prescribing ban, with pharmacies dispensing nearly 5,450 kilos of dried flower in 2025. That's a 12% year-on-year increase. But there's a catch. Revenue actually fell by 19% as prices dropped sharply, meaning operators are now selling more cannabis for less money. Across Europe more broadly, a growing tension is emerging between clinical science and consumer regulation, particularly around CBD. Industry voices are warning that Europe's food law framework may now be out of step with emerging medical evidence, creating uncertainty for companies and patients alike. Here in the UK, advocacy group LEAP has criticised Prime Minister Keir Starmer for failing to engage meaningfully with drug reform, arguing that current policy remains rooted in outdated assumptions rather than public health outcomes. And in France, the incoming medical cannabis framework is entering its final design phase, but debate is intensifying over whether it's being built primarily for patients or for the institutions that regulate them. That's all for this week. I'm Dave Barton from Thermidor with your Cannabis Coast to Coast International News Report.
Unless you've been completely out of touch over the past week, you know that the United States started a war with Iran last weekend. They have already taken out their supreme leader and badly damaged their Iranian navy and their cache of missiles. It's been those missile launches that has caused the most damage outside of Iran. Neighboring countries in the Middle East have been targeted, and the war is spreading throughout that region. So not only are missiles dropping from the sky, so is the stock market. In fact, it's really crashed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 797 points, or 1.7%, from its record set the day before, while the NASDAQ Composite lost 2.3%. So let's get to our expert, Doug Miller, who is still high on Wall Street.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis Stock Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Tilray's acquired major assets of the iconic UK craft brewery Brewdog for about $44.3 million, gaining control of the company's global brand, intellectual property, UK brewing operations, and 11 brew pubs across the UK and Ireland. The deal gives Tilray a powerful international beverage platform and is expected to generate about $200 million in annual revenue as the company continues building one of the largest diversified craft beverage portfolios in the world. However, the acquisition comes during a major restructuring of Brewdog. The struggling brewer had been losing money for years, forcing 38 bars to close and about 484 jobs to be cut, although roughly 733 positions will be preserved under Tilray's ownership. For Tilray, this move fits into a bigger strategy, building a global lifestyle brand across cannabis, beverages, and wellness products, positioning itself for future growth as regulations evolve worldwide. And investors should note Tilray says the combined beverage platform could help push the company toward over $1 billion in annual revenue. So let's see how the stock chart looks. Tilray's trading around $7.21, and it's been pulling back lately. It does look like the entire cannabis sector wants to pop, and this chart looks great for Tilray. So watch for dips, trade smart, and lock in those profits. And that's this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
The Office of Cannabis Management in New York State has a new executive director. He is John Kagia. He was the director of policy for that organization for the past year or so. And before coming to New York, he was the chief information officer for New Frontier, which is when our executive producer, Jimmy Young, first talked to John 4 years ago. He reconnected with John this past year at the NCIA's lobby days in Washington, D.C. in May. And even then, John recognized the potential of the New York market that he will now be overseeing.
New York is really starting to show that it is the most exciting, most dynamic, and most opportunity-rich market in the country.
And when you look at California, which is still the largest revenue producer in this particular industry, they continue to screw up their state. How is New York going to make sure that they don't screw up with a mature market after a few more years? Because California still can't get it right.
Look, regulating cannabis is a difficult business, and if this was an easy thing, everybody'd be doing it. Part of what we're trying to be very intentional about in New York is, one, learning from the experiences of others. We have seen supply chain imbalances create acute downward pressure on prices and lead to a lot of cultivators not being able to operate. We've seen market imbalances lead to a huge amount of either diversion or inversion. And so you need to think about how well balanced your supply chain is. We've seen how limited enforcement has led to the explosion of the unregulated market, and that's why we're being so intentional now about devoting resources to enforcement. It really is critical that we pay very close attention to the history of the markets that have been doing this for a long time as we're building our market, but also critical that we also build a market that reflects the priorities, the ethos, and the values of New Yorkers. And so two of the things that have been really important in New York, one has been about ensuring that social equity participants not only get a seat at the table, but are able to stay in the game over the medium term. I think we've built a market that enables that. And two, more broadly, that this is an ecosystem that is sustained by small and medium-sized businesses, and that we're not handing this market solely to the world's largest cannabis companies.
Here's an interesting story coming out of Wisconsin this week. Governor Tony Evers wrote a letter to every member of his state's legislature to urge them all to protect that state's hemp market. In his letter, the governor said, quote, "Hemp-derived products currently support a growing sector of legitimate businesses across Wisconsin, employing nearly 3,500 employees and contributing meaningfully to local economies with over $700 million in economic production. Many of these existing lawful products would be reclassified in a manner that effectively eliminates existing business models, forcing closures, layoffs, and lost investment." Unquote. Wisconsin does not have a legal adult use cannabis program, and now they have a viable hemp market that will be banned if the federal deadline of November does not change. How about some good news this week? In Maryland this week, lawmakers have approved a bill that will allow first responders and rescue workers to partake in cannabis while off duty. Christopher Bright has more on this from Maryland.
I'm Christopher Bright from The Enlightened Voice. Welcome to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'll be bringing you the latest cannabis headlines from Maryland. The Maryland Senate has passed a bill to protect firefighters and rescue workers from punishment for using medical marijuana while off duty. In a 33-11 vote Friday, lawmakers approved SB 439, sponsored by Democrat Carl Johnson. It cleared the committee last week and revives a similar measure that stalled out in the House last year. If enacted, the law would bar employers from disciplining, firing, or discriminating against registered medical cannabis patients in a fire and rescue roles just for participating in the program or testing positive for THC off duty. Job conditions, pay, or opportunities couldn't be affected based solely on that, but departments can still enforce zero tolerance for any on-duty cannabis impairment. During a debate, Republican Senator William Folden voiced his safety concerns, noting that first responders need to stay sharp and alert during and current THC test cannot detect an impairment. Sponsor Jackson said visible impairment will be handled appropriately like other drugs such as opioids. He emphasized firefighters' stresses, chronic pain, and PTSD, which cannabis is a safer alternative to opioids, which managing the symptoms without career risk. That's all for this week's Maryland Cannabis Report. I'm Christopher Bright from The Enlightened Voice, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Are you familiar with the history of cannabis legalization in California? That movement started in the 1990s with Dennis Perron and Jack Herer, who were trying to get medical cannabis legalized to combat the AIDS and HIV crisis at the time. The efforts that led to the passing of Prop 215 in 1996 were the first state to approve the use of medical cannabis. The gay community continues to be heavily involved in cannabis reform and will never forget that impact that those early pioneers and advocates made in their community. This week, our cannabis correspondent, Dina Naguib, spent some time talking with Scott Schmidt in West Hollywood, where she met up with him while attending the Cannabis Culture and Change Conference. Here's Dina with Scott Schmidt in West Hollywood.
I'm Dina Naguib, Principal Consultant at Grass Goddess Consulting, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm here today with a special report in West Hollywood because we are here for the Cannabis Culture and Change Conference. I have Scott Schmidt, who is the Executive Director of the Emerald Village, West Hollywood. And this is your event that we have going on today. Can you tell us a little bit about what the event is and why you brought everyone to West Hollywood?
Yeah, well, thanks for coming to West Hollywood. I believe it's really one of the best cannabis destinations in the world, especially if you want the best products and the best environments. And really, for me, to tell the West Hollywood story through a lens that connects the intersection of the things that make this city great, our creativity, our communities, our cannabis. It's been an amazing opportunity. I was approached last fall by our Vice Mayor, Danny Hang, who had an idea. At the same time, I was approached by Rich Magana from Kristi Cannabis, who wanted to screen his documentary, Join the Club, about the early days of medical cannabis. And like, how can we tie all this together? And really, West Hollywood was what ties it all together. And the fact that medical cannabis, has its roots in the LGBT community, and it has its roots in cities like West Hollywood and San Francisco. Cannabis lounges, the first licensed legal cannabis lounges in the world, are in West Hollywood. The coffee shops in Amsterdam, not legal, it's tolerated, right? So we have that, we can claim that throne and wear that medal. And so it's really been gratifying to see everyone come out, and all the amazing people that have joined us, not just from West Hollywood, but from around, the California and the cannabis community has been an amazing experience.
You did really get together a great group of people today, and the panels were really interesting. I've been so impressed. I also got a little bit emotional when you were closing us out with your keynote, and when you just touched on, some of the comparisons with the gay community and cannabis. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we started, our struggles, coincided, in the late 1900s, there was the AIDS crisis, people were dying, there were drugs that had awful side effects, and it was cannabis that helped people get through. And, Dennis Crone and Brownie Mary up in San Francisco, and you've got Scott Eastman and, Richard Eastman, Scott Emler and Richard Eastman down here in West Hollywood. Only one of them is still with us. It's really a story to connect it. And, in going around the cannabis community, especially on the business side, it's very bro-coded often. Mm-hmm. And I was like, these people can learn from how we in the gay community achieved marriage equality, 10, 15 years ago, and how we grew our coalition, and how we normalized being gay or lesbian, and how we were able to communicate to people that maybe wouldn't be traditional supporters. And that's what got us across the finish line.
You heard him, and I'm Dina Naguib with Grass Goddess Consulting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Since its inception, the state of Missouri has figured out a way to create a vibrant cannabis market, but like many states who are new to the cannabis legalization movement, bad actors give that effort a black eye. Now, regulators in that state want to increase fines for those who break the rules, and will be increasing those fines up to $100,000. Here's our man in Missouri with more from that Show Me State. It's Brandon Jones.
Hey everybody, it's Brandon Jones with Bee Green Distribution with the Missouri Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. And that's right, as in most industries, there are some bad actors. And so what they're trying to do is a new proposed law here in the state of Missouri that anybody to operate a cultivation facility would have to go through a little bit further of a background check. And then all managers would have to be able to go through and get an agent ID. And to obtain an agent ID, you do have to go through a background check and just provide other documents to prove that you are who you are, and then make sure that you should be operating in this facility and didn't have a background that should be keeping you out. Other things they're trying to do here in the state of Missouri is changing the tax laws. So we did have a lot of revenue coming in, a lot of money going places, but the auditor thinks there should be more going to some state services. So the auditor is looking at the breakdown of the tax law and proposing some changes in that as well. And then, as you can see, weather is getting nicer here in Kansas City. Missouri is coming out with a lot more events, getting ready to have consumption outside. No more consumption events going on all over the place here in the state of Missouri. So be ready to get out here and have fun. I'm Brandon Jones with Be Green Distribution with Missouri Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Stay medicated and educated. Have a great week.
Next up, an update on Ohio, where lawmakers continue to try to sort out the fall of the bill that changes what the voters there passed 2 years ago at the ballot box. Here's our Ohio correspondent, Christina Brisson.
I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. So most of what's going on in Ohio right now still continues around SB 56. Signatures are being collected. They have to be turned in, I believe, by March 19th for this referendum to go into place. So hopefully the SB 56 can be voted on by voters later on in the normal election year. So hopefully that's going to happen, because there are a lot of things people don't realize about this bill. I encourage you to look into a lot of the details, because there are a lot of changes that don't have to do with the intoxicating hemp. They really put way too many things together here. The Attorney General is continuing to sue multiple companies, accusing these various cannabis companies of acting cartel-like and trying to block other smaller businesses out and artificially hiking up prices for cannabis here in Ohio. So that's more to see how things play out. We'll see what kind of happens over the next couple of weeks. It's going to be really key. Ohioans for Cannabis Choice is out there. They've been listing places to go ahead and sign up for that petition. So I encourage you all to get out there and look at the information. Thank you so much. That is your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
This was the first week of primary season, and there are plenty of eyes on the state of Texas. Coming out of the Democratic primary, a non-binding question about the legalization of cannabis passed, with 80% of the voters saying yes to the question of cannabis legalization. The question asks, quote, "Do you agree or disagree with the following? Texas should legalize cannabis for adults and automatically expunge criminal records for past low-level cannabis offenses," unquote. This is a long way from being adopted, but because it is a non-binding issue, even Republicans can vote on that question during primary season. Just remember, this is the same state that tried to ban all intoxicating hemp products last year. When it comes to ballot questions, few states have tried harder than Florida to get an adult use question on the ballot. Even after failing to get more than 60% of the vote in the last election, the Smart and Safe Florida group continues to battle the courts and the state government over the validation of the signatures collected to try to get an adult use ballot question on the ballot in this election. Well, now, let's check in on the Sunshine State with our new Florida correspondent, Farah Woodall, a registered nurse and caregiver in that state. Here's Farah.
I'm Farah, owner of My Earthly Essentials, here with the Florida Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Despite not qualifying an adult use question on the ballot for this fall, the Smart and Safe group is not giving up. Once again, the subject of signature gathering is being challenged. 50,000 signatures plus were challenged on their veracity at the February 1st deadline to make it onto the ballot. Now the Smart and Safe group is going back to court to prove that they collected enough signatures. But fighting the political and legal machine in this state continues to make it as difficult as possible for fair support. While Florida continues to fight to get an adult use initiative accepted on another ballot question, the state does have the largest medical cannabis market in the country. At last check, the state had just over 920,000 patients registered at the end of last year, and that number grows daily. The largest MSO in the industry in the U.S. is TrueLeaf. They have 233 dispensaries in different states, and they own a majority of them in Florida. That company released its earnings for last year and claimed $1.2 billion in revenue with a gross margin of 60%. They added 11 dispensaries this past year. Where TrueLeaf has emerged as quite a success in that industry, it continues to show growing pains. So, a vibrant medical program makes up for the frustrations of launching an adult use question on the ballot in November. Florida is no longer asking whether cannabis belongs, it's deciding how cannabis fits. That'll do it for this week's Florida Cannabis Report. I'm Farah with my Earthly Essentials, here reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Now it's time to check back in with Tina Tasaka, who covers the cannabis market of the indigenous people in this country. We call her report the Tribal Lands Cannabis Report. Here's Tina.
I'm Tina Tasaka, and this is the Tribal Nations Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The Minnesota Court of Appeals has ruled that the state cannot prosecute Todd Thompson, a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, for processing cannabis on tribal land. Thompson was arrested at the tobacco shop on White Earth Reservation one day after Minnesota legalized recreational marijuana. Authorities seized more than 7 pounds of cannabis and thousands in cash, charging him with first-degree possession, a felony carrying up to 5 years in prison. Citing the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, the court determined cannabis possession is a civil regulatory matter, not a criminal one, especially since the tribe has its own cannabis laws. The decision is being called a landmark affirmation of tribal sovereignty and applies to all Minnesota tribes, subject to Public Law 280. Thompson says he has no immediate plans to reopen his shop. I've reported many times on this tribe. Well, there's more. The Omaha tribe is moving forward with plans to open Nebraska's first tribally operated cannabis dispensary, asserting full sovereignty under Tribal Code Title 51. The new facility, expected to open later this year, will offer both medical and adult use cannabis on reservation land, well ahead of Nebraska's still developing statewide medical program. But the move has sparked sharp resistance from state officials. Nebraska's governor has warned that the tribe could lose millions in shared tobacco tax revenue if it proceeds, a pressure tactic tribal leaders call an overreach and a threat to self-governance. Despite the warning, the Omaha tribe says the dispensary, along with a tribally run testing lab, is part of a long-term economic strategy focused on sovereignty, public health access, and sustainable revenue, and they're not backing down. That's the latest in Tribal Nations Cannabis. I'm Tina Tasaka for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
And finally, a shout out to Ethan Hawke, the actor who is performing on Broadway right now. He was reminiscing this week about the very first award he won as an actor. And believe it or not, the award was a bong presented to him by High Times at the so-called Stony Awards in the early 2000s. The author of the Celeb Stoner newsletter, Steve Bloom, was the editor at High Times at the time. And back then, Ethan Hawke was honored at the third annual Stonies for his role in Tape, which recognized him for the best stoned performance of the year. Considering that Ice-T and Snoop Dogg were also in attendance makes that award unforgettable for Hawke, who claimed that, quote, somehow having it be a Stony validates my whole youth journey, unquote. Another reason why we end every show by saying it's a whole new world of weed out there. Consume responsibly. I'm Alaina Pinto. Thanks for watching this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. We'll see you next week.
So what's your life story? Do you define yourself by your career or by your personal journey? The trick is to tell it in under 15 seconds. Here's mine. I'm Jimmy Young, a 30-year Emmy Award-winning sportscaster from New England who's a teacher and coach in my soul. I've mentored hundreds of young people, but I'm most proud of my only child, a 35-year-old son, Gabriel, who's now a licensed electrician in North Carolina who can fix anything. How about you? If you want to build your confidence enough to walk up to a stranger at a networking event and start a conversation, sign up for my office hours with Professor Jimmy live on Monday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Now, there's a fee of $1 to hang out with me for that hour, but I'll share some tips so you can tell your life story in 15 seconds. Just log on to ProfessorJimmy.com, and guess what? I'll even give you your $1 back if you don't laugh and learn something that can help you become a better communicator.